Good morning and welcome. Freedom, opportunity, accountability, and compassion. These are the foundational values that define the public service of President and Mrs. Bush, and these are the values that form the basis of everything we do here at the Bush Center. We execute our mission, that is through policy solutions and public engagement, the Bush Center ensures opportunity for all, strengthens democracy, and advances free societies. We combine ideas and action to improve the lives of people at home and around the world. I'd like to welcome you today to the Bush Center's program, The Struggle for Freedom, presented in partnership with Freedom House and the National Endowment for Democracy. This program comes at a critical time. It seems like across the globe there are struggles and challenges. Each of these has at its core basic conflicts between freedom and authoritarianism. People and societies that wish to live against a backdrop of respect for the individual and individual choice versus those who seek to dictate how people shall live and from which set of choices they must choose. In President Bush's second inaugural, he declared that there is one force of history that can break the reign of hatred and resentment and expose the pretensions of tyrants and reward the hopes of the decent and tolerant, and that is the force of human freedom. I've observed three ironies, however, in this struggle. First, mankind, if it's so innate to our nature, why is freedom not the norm? Despite the fact that deep in everyone's core is the desire to be free, over the course of human history, more often than not, mankind has lived in a society where freedoms have been severely restricted. Political philosophers and sociologists have been studying this contradiction seemingly forever. Western liberal democracies started breaking the shackles of top-down governance over 200 years ago, and our American democratic experiment has evolved from that tradition. However, over the centuries, countless times such liberal democracies backtracked and succumbed to the rule of those who would restrict freedom. Even once achieved, freedom is not a given. It must be defended. Second, the very definition of freedom continues to evolve. Our institutional frameworks which created a self-governing system were designed by visionary yet flawed individuals. They were brilliant and they loved inefficiency. The founders feared a pure democracy, so they went out of their way to establish a representative democracy, a republic full of checks and balances, frequent elections, tensions between state and federal authority, and a Bill of Rights that would prevent any single individual or tyrannical majority from violating basic human freedoms that would define us. Our Bill of Rights enumerated freedoms, and importantly, the Ninth Amendment makes clear that our rights as citizens are not limited to those specifically outlined in the Constitution. Non-enumerated rights are ours, and we still wrestle with that definition. And finally, as we have learned, freedom is not free. While we are quick to defend rights conferred to us by a free society, we must also appreciate the duties conferred on us as members of a free society. As individuals, we have duties to respect each other, to respect the rule of law, and to appreciate that others before us made incredible sacrifices so that we could live in this society. We must be prepared to defend it and support our democratic institutions. We are blessed that our 250-year-old Constitution is a living document with mechanisms to amend, interpret, adjudicate, and evolve. As we know, our experiment in self-governing does not always get it right, and sometimes we get it very wrong before correcting. Despite it all, however, I say to those who doubt the value of American ideals, take a look at those who are streaming into our country from places like Venezuela, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Cuba, and others who would sacrifice everything to step foot on our soil. We must also remember that the world is watching us. We have the obligation to show the world what freedom looks like. This is the focus of our agenda today. Freedom looks like a president, such as President Bush, who used his chair to call out inhumane treatment of dissidents around the world, be they in China, North Korea, or Burma. Freedom looks like a former president who calls out threats, whether they be the mobs on the streets of Charlottesville or in the hallways of our nation's capital. Freedom looks like a country that is not afraid to exercise its soft power by tackling the AIDS epidemic to save an entire generation on the African continent. Freedom looks like a society that will not shy away from conflicts between freedom and tyranny in places like Ukraine today, or years ago in Afghanistan, which served as a staging ground for global terror. And freedom does not look like making nice with the tyrannical Iranian regime, nor being silent when freedom seekers there are in the streets willing to give up their lives for freedom. If freedom is to come, we must stand with the brave Iranian protesters on the streets and call out that support loudly. Today, we will focus on this drive for freedom. It's all around us, and it's impossible to ignore. Sometimes the struggle is between nations, other times it's within nations, led by courageous individuals. The role of dissidents is vital to the process, to calling attention to conditions on the ground. Dissidents can then be joined by silent majorities who have the courage to turn such dissent into a movement by ending their silence. And a movement is required to establish a competing vision of governance where freedom can be assured. History has been defined by ordinary people doing extraordinary things and rising to the moment. I can hear you set the tone when shouted by a leader over 20 years ago standing on rubble at ground zero. I need ammunition, not a ride, is an iconic present-day expression by a leader rising to his moment to defend freedom and not to retreat. We are honored here today to have so many representatives of Ukraine who are engaged in this conflict. And finally, the democracy of Taiwan needs to be supported. Freedom benefits everyone, as evidenced by the fact that the GDP per capita in Taiwan is 4 times that on mainland China. And we are honored today to kick off our program with a message from President of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, which will then be followed by our own David Kramer, the Executive Director of the Bush Institute. Thank you all for being here in support of freedom. Your presence is an important statement. Thank you, and enjoy the program.
President Bush, Madam First Lady, distinguished speakers and guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I would like to begin my talk by thanking the George W. Bush Institute, the National Endowment for Democracy, and Freedom House for inviting me to speak at this important event on the threats freedom faces and how we can advance liberty worldwide. Just a couple of weeks ago, in recognition of the unprecedented challenge facing democracy and its advocates, Taiwan hosted the 11th Global Assembly of the World Movement for Democracy. With our partner, the National Endowment for Democracy, we welcome more than 200 advocates of democracy, some of whom have devoted their lives to this work, and others who have recently started careers advancing this cause. These supporters of democracy make connections and strategize on how we all can work together better to make democracy stronger and more resilient. At this Global Assembly, we had the special honor of welcoming parliamentarians and members of civil society from Ukraine. I had the pleasure of meeting them and of speaking to them in person. They came not only with stories of courage, but also with warnings. Though he was held back by the war, Chairman Alexander Murasko of the Ukrainian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee still appeared online at the Assembly to share his assessment that the grand strategy of authoritarian regimes is to divide and destroy democracies one by one. He also summed up the response that we must adopt. That is, the rallying cry from all democracies must be one for all and all for one. In addition, this past August, Taiwan organized the Regional Religious Freedom Forum. Participants from across the Indo-Pacific shared their stories and advocacy experiences and discussed how to secure the right to practice one's faith at a time when religious freedom around the world is being curtailed by authoritarian powers. These recent events are just part of why I am very pleased to see Mr. Wilson, Dr. Twining, Mr. Abramovich, and Mr. Turkel among the speakers at this important gathering on the global struggle for freedom. Their presence at this conference can serve as an inspiration to our existing collaborations. I hope you all can learn from their experiences in Taiwan while you formulate ways to push back against authoritarian threats and utilize technology to secure the future of freedom. I want to reiterate here that this conference on the world's struggle for freedom could not have convened a more significant time, as democracies and the rules-based international order are being challenged on a daily basis. As we work to resolve the lingering effects of the pandemic on the global economy and health, the fluid political situation in many countries around the world have only added to the already long list of challenges before us. The dangerous potential of authoritarian regimes to corrode democratic institutions and tarnish human rights and civic space cannot be ignored. Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine serves as a prime example. This war is proof that dictatorships will do whatever it takes to achieve their goal of expansionism. Regretfully, the Taiwanese people are very familiar with such aggression, and we have our own experience with the struggle for freedom. Only about 3 decades ago, members of civil society in Taiwan took to the streets. They protested and advocated for the lifting of martial law. They asked for more political and social rights for the citizens. And they advocated for the democratization of Taiwan. At the heart of the struggle was the embrace of democracy, a choice that the Taiwanese people fought for after decades of authoritarian rule. And once the Taiwanese people took this path, there was no turning back. In recent years, the beautiful island we call home has been confronted by increasingly aggressive threats from our authoritarian neighbor, the People's Republic of China. From daily military intimidations, gray zone activities, and influence operations, to cyber attacks and periodic attempts at economic coercion. China has taken a range of actions with the goal of creating doubt and undermining confidence in what the Taiwanese people have worked so diligently for, that is, our democratic way of life. But the people of Taiwan continue to meet these persistent threats with calm and composure. And the Taiwanese people have never shied away from utilizing their skills and expertise to counter authoritarian interference. For Taiwan, democracy is more than a fundamental value that unites our people. It is also a critical asset in addressing major challenges. Taiwan is now in the position to share its experience with the world and create alliance, allowing democracies to more effectively deal with crises and counter the threats of authoritarianism. As we observe Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine from the other side of the world, Taiwan has been honored to play a role in assisting Ukraine in its struggle to defend its sovereignty and freedom. Together with like-minded partners, we will also make efforts to support Ukraine's reconstruction of its schools, hospitals, and infrastructure that have been destroyed by the war. Our efforts must not stop here. The menacing behavior of authoritarian regimes should be a wake-up call to all democracies. We must work together to strengthen our resilience and safeguard our values. But we can only achieve this goal with ample understanding of authoritarian tactics. That is why I'm pleased to learn that the George W. Bush Institute is already tackling important tasks such as combating disinformation, reducing corruption that fuels authoritarian governments, supporting civic renewal, and advancing human rights as national security. With all these ongoing efforts, we can now work together on countering and reducing influence exerted by authoritarian regimes worldwide. We must also strengthen the alliance of democracies to safeguard and serve the interests of the international community. I know there is an important panel in this conference on how the United States can help support democracy and human rights. U.S. administrations and members of Congress have always been staunch supporters of Taiwan's democratization and the democratic institutions we now enjoy. I hope Taiwan, along with the U.S., can now lend its support to those struggling to advocate for democracy and human rights in other countries. Before I conclude, I want to take this opportunity to thank the United States for its unwavering support for Taiwan and thank the U.S. Congress for passing legislation to help ensure Taiwan's security. Of course, I also want to thank President Bush and the George W. Bush Institute, the National Endowment for Democracy, and Freedom House for the invitation to speak. As Ukrainian parliamentarian Kira Rudek told us while she was in Taiwan, she said, "History is teaching us over and over again that unpunished and unremedied evil deeds will return. Let us work together to ensure that the expansionist deeds of authoritarian states neither flourish nor return." Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute, David Kramer.
Good morning and welcome again to the Struggle for Freedom Conference here at the George W. Bush Institute in partnership with Freedom House and the National Endowment for Democracy. And a huge thanks to President Tsai for providing those remarks to set the stage here for us today. Regimes and the way they treat their own people are often indicative of how they'll behave beyond their borders in foreign policy. And so when we see the worst crackdown on human rights inside Russia under the Putin regime, we shouldn't be shocked or surprised when Putin decides to invade some of his neighbors, including today Ukraine. With the genocide against Uyghurs in China, we shouldn't be surprised when the Communist Party in Beijing threatens an island of democracy like Taiwan. And when the Iranian regime cracks down on peaceful protesters demanding respect for human rights and freedom, we shouldn't be surprised that they are among the leading sponsors of terrorism. What happens in other countries matters here. It is important to people in Dallas, in Texas, the entire United States. And that's why we wanted to bring this conference to you today, to underscore how important developments in other places that may seem far away are in fact very important and matter to us every single day. We have put together a great conference with a number of stars, activists, dissidents, leaders in the non-governmental organization community, and leading officials. And we're very grateful that all of you are here with us today in the auditorium and watching on live stream. To set the stage for us, we have a terrific opening panel, and moderating it will be Paula Dobriansky, who is a former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs in President Bush's administration, a longtime friend and colleague of mine, and let me have Paula introduce the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to emphasize the statement made by the President of Taiwan. She mentioned that this forum is being held at a most crucial and critical time, and she's absolutely correct. And for that, I want to thank and recognize the Bush Center, the Bush Institute, Ken Hirsch, David Kramer, and the entire team that's hosted us here today, and all of the supporters of the Center and the Institute who are here with us. We're also very gratified that the National Endowment for Democracy also is a sponsor, as well as Freedom House. So thank you for that. We have a lot to cover and in a really targeted time this morning. And I think that we're going to set, at least I hope, a bit of a framework and tone as we go forward for the day. We have a star panel, distinguished speakers. Let me introduce them very briefly. We have Damon Wilson here, who is the president of the National Endowment for Democracy, and thank you for the co-sponsorship.
Thank you, Paula.
Nicole Bibbins-Sadaka, who is Executive Vice President of Freedom House, and she is also the David and Kelly File Fellow here at the Bush Institute. Welcome. And Dan Twining, who is the President of the International Republican Institute. So with that, let me go to the first question. And Nicole, I'm going to go to you first. And we're going to take it with each of you. You, Dan, and then back to Damon here. You know, the title of this conversation is The Global Struggle for Freedom. Define for us, what in your view is that global struggle for freedom right now? How do you see it? And why does it matter to those out here in this audience, here right now in Dallas?
Yeah. Thank you, Paula, and thank you to the Bush Institute for hosting us. It's a delight for Freedom House and Ned to co-host such an important event at a time like this. We know that 38% of the world's population lives in a not free country. That means that the things which we enjoy every day, the ability to speak freely, to criticize our government, or to support the candidates that we care about, to worship freely, to speak openly about political issues, to assemble with those that we have like-minded interests with, those don't exist in those countries. And we know exercising those freedoms will likely land you in jail or worse. And we know that there's only one reason, and that's because there are authoritarian governments around the world that are committed to restricting the space for their own citizens in order to hold on to power and to enhance their own personal interests. They're doing it through corruption, they're doing it through repression, and that's what we're seeing around the world. We know that only 20% of the world's population enjoys much of the freedom that we enjoy. But the concern is also that those authoritarians are not just repressing those at home. They are taking this show on the road, so to speak. What that means is that they are reaching out beyond their borders to repress politicians, oppositionists, human rights defenders all over the world, including in democracies. They are disrupting the international financial system with the same type of corruption that they exercise at home. And so this is not just something from faraway countries. This is something that's hitting us at home, and it's hitting the global system. And so I think for all of us, regardless of where we sit, this is a concern that we all share.
All right, thank you. Dan, let's go to you. How do you see it? And why does it matter?
Paul, I'm very proud to be here with you and David Kramer and so many friends. I would just like to say we have great freedom fighters here with us from Venezuela and Russia and other countries, so I hope you'll have a chance to engage with them. They're the real heroes. A couple things. Why does this matter? Our way of life, our freedom at home, as Nicole suggests, is not safe in a world where authoritarian aggression is on the march. You have seen Putin's brutal attempt to swallow a democratic neighbor in Ukraine. You just saw President Tsai of Taiwan. Xi Jinping in China would like to swallow Taiwan brutally in the same way and kill or imprison her and oppress China's free people in the same way that people in China are oppressed. Why should we care? We should care because the world's pathologies emanate from either dictatorships or broken states. That's why we should care about democracy. Authoritarian aggression that swallows democratic neighbors and crushes aspiration, the kind of dictatorship that destroys human potential in places like Cuba, the kind of violent extremism that flourishes where freedom is not available to citizens and democratic dignity and rights, uncontrolled mass migration. You've seen a third of the population of Venezuela leave that country. It was the richest country in South America because of brutal, corrupt dictatorship there. So we should care about this struggle, I think, for moral reasons, but we should care about it for very pragmatic reasons. And we should understand, Paula, that the liberties we enjoy at home are not safe in a world where strong men are committing the kind of crimes that we're seeing in real time in Ukraine. That is dangerous for America, even if we don't care about foreign policy and grand strategy. That we don't want to live in that kind of world, and we have an obligation to support freedom around the world because it produces all these other things that are quite good for us here at home.
Damon, same question, please.
Paula, thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here at the Bush Institute. We love partnering with the Bush Institute Freedom House on this. Shout out to Ken and David for hosting us, and it was a real honor to be here with President Bush, who is such an articulate leader on these issues and the freedom agenda. The struggle for freedom, you look around the world and you see and you feel what the struggle for freedom is. It's President Tsai of Taiwan trying to preserve and promote a vibrant, healthy democracy in Asia threatened by an authoritarian China. It's the incredibly courageous women on the streets of Iran demanding respect, demanding individual liberty. It's people who are toiling in Russian prisons because they dare call the invasion of Ukraine a war, or those who are incarcerated in Cuba who stood up last summer and continue to protest for their voice, their rights. You see the struggle for freedom universally around the world. You feel it, as Dan said, you will feel it and hear it from some of the colleagues who are with us here. But its most simple element, mothers and fathers know that they want the best for their children to be able to grow, prosper, and be who they can be and thrive. And at the end of the day, it's quite simple. It's the ability to be free to determine your own path as an individual, collectively as a society, to determine your own future. It's an elegant, simple idea. Collectively, the struggle for freedom is what we're all invested in to support each other's ability to determine our destiny. And the reason we're having this conference, the struggle's historic. It's been with us throughout history, and you can follow waves of democratization. You can follow the data that Nicole cited to recognize that we're in a democratic recession today. But as President Tsai said, as Paula started with, this is a consequential moment for freedom and democracy around the world, because the struggle we're in right now, it's different. We've seen dictators learning from each other. We've seen not only taking advantage of our own open societies, erosion in democracies, but an incredible sharp repression at home that's led to extraordinary numbers of those fleeing their countries for freedom. We've seen that repression, as Nicole said, being exported. The tools, the tactics, the technologies are sharpened in Beijing and Moscow, but end up in Managua, Tehran, around the world. And they're using a system of collection of understanding a different information environment, the tools of technology, AI-enabled surveillance, and our financial systems to cement dictatorship with kleptocracy and money to stay in power and repress the aspirations of individuals. That's the struggle for freedom, and it matters for us because our ability as free people to remain free, prosperous, to live in peace. Everything our country has to spend money on for national security is because of this assault on democracy from autocrats. It is fundamental to our way of life and our quality of life.
Damon, let me ask you a question, and I'm going back to the others with this, but also some different questions. But with you, let me ask you, the Biden administration just released its national security strategy. And in it, there is a description of the way forward, at least as they see it, as to how to deal with this issue. And they frame it as Democrats versus autocrats. In your view, is that the way to frame it? And what is maybe missing and what is in that report?
That's a great question, Paula. Thank you for that. First of all, let me give a shout out to the Biden administration, President Biden, for putting democracy at the center of public discourse, at the center of talking about the administration's foreign policy. I think building on what we saw with President Bush's articulation of a freedom agenda, that language matters. And it matters what the United States, what an American president says. At the same time, I think we need to be careful when we think about the struggle between democracy and autocracy, and I think there's something to that. We aren't just seeing isolated issues out there. We're seeing an autocracy, Inc. We're seeing bad guys working together. We're seeing the effort to undermine the norms that support democracy around the world. It's an important framing. And yet I think the most important thing when you think about the struggle for freedom, the real struggle are those Russians who believe in a democratic Russia, those Ukrainians that are fighting to protect their freedom from Vladimir Putin, those Iranians who believe that they have the opportunity to have the same rights that we share, and I think the Venezuelans who are with us that you'll hear from in this conversation. And I think it's very often important that we not fall into an easy binary that understands democracy, autocracy, that the most important part of the struggle for freedom is for those that enjoy freedom, is to be able to simply support the similar aspirations, desires of people themselves. Ultimately, it will be Chinese Democrats, Russian Democrats, Cuban Democrats, Zimbabwean Democrats that fundamentally shape the future of this struggle. So the national security strategy puts a sharp focus on this, and I applaud that. But we can't fall into a binary clash. We need to understand the most important allies we have are those who live in autocratic repressed regimes who know that their children deserve better.
Nicole, if you'd like to comment on that, but also could you dig deeper on the issue of human rights defenders?
Yeah.
How can we be helpful to them at this critical time?
Absolutely, absolutely. What I know, and I very much agree with what Damon said, we know in every country, the United States and those who care about democracy have allies in every country around the world. Some of those sit in government, but many of them sit in the streets, they sit in jails, they sit in their apartments and in their offices, and they're struggling for the exact same thing we are, which is freedom and the protection of human rights. And it's really incumbent on us that live in democracies to support those activists, because they are the ones that are going to bring the change in their country. So what does that look like? It certainly looks like us using our voice. I mean, we have seen, and I think President Bush was such a leader in this and able to raise the cases of people who are sitting in prison, raise the cases of those who are being targeted by their government so that they are not alone and so that the world's eyes are on the cases of those individuals, and that the repressive regimes know that they can't get away with it, right? That the world is watching. Some of it is technical support, right? They are in the streets, they are in raising their voices, they're doing advocacy, they're documenting the human rights abuses that they are facing every day, and so our support for them in that is important as well. We know autocrats are collaborating using technology and using financial transfers. We need to have the exact same support system and the exact same network of supporting human rights defenders with sharper technology, stronger financial capacity, so that they're able to do their work for freedom in the same way that we're able to do it freely here. We're increasingly seeing human rights defenders are also not at home. Many of them have had to flee. Many of them have been forced out of their countries. So they are now sitting in the United States, in Germany, in free countries around the world. And we have a responsibility as well. When those courageous individuals choose to come to our countries where we enjoy freedom, we have a responsibility and an opportunity to welcome them, to support them in their continued work to bring change in their countries.
Okay, thank you for that. Dan, if you'd like to comment on the question I posed to Damon about the national security strategy, but also you're a China expert and also Indo-Pacific. You've really spent a lot of time in the region. What is the challenge now from China? It's changed. In fact, your words, it's changed in terms of the struggle overall. What are we confronted with now, and what should we be doing?
Thank you. So I would like to invoke the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was very close with President Bush here, and they did historic things together with the US-Japan alliance. Shinzo Abe coined this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And now a free and open Indo-Pacific is not necessarily full of free and open societies, right? There are countries like Vietnam that are not free. But a free and open Indo-Pacific comprises nations that fundamentally want to prevent a new sphere of influence from China, a new kind of imperial caste to regional order. These are countries that the US can work with. It's very interesting, Paula, you're a great historian. When the US established NATO in the late 40s and built our Asian alliance structure, we built alliances with countries that were not democracies, including Japan, including South Korea, including Taiwan, which was a military ally of the United States, including the Philippines, including countries like Turkey and Greece that were not democracies. But guess what? Working together very closely with the United States, those countries developed, prospered, and opened up over time and became more open societies. So I think that's the vision. We want to create a free world coalition to uphold basic norms and values around freedom of the seas, around sovereignty, around resisting malign foreign authoritarian interference, and around the right of each nation to determine its own destiny. Now, on China, great question. I know we're going to want to talk about it. It's worth reading the joint declaration that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin issued just before the Beijing Olympics and just before Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Because if you want to know what an alternative world order that wasn't structured around American power and values looks like, they have produced a blueprint for you. In their joint declaration, they define a world of authoritarian spheres of influence, a world where democratic alliances are over, a world where citizens do not get to choose leaders, but leaders, essentially, citizens work for leaders rather than leaders working for citizens. That is a very dangerous world. It recalls things like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? Between Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany in an earlier era. It's scary stuff to imagine. We need to push back with other free nations against China's efforts not only to develop its extraordinary Orwellian surveillance suite, but to export that. China has exported surveillance technology to 80 countries around the world to help unfree governments control their citizens. China runs influence operations in all of our countries, including in the United States, to try to get us to back down from things like supporting Taiwan or holding China accountable for its human rights abuses or sharing technologies with China that empower its military arsenal against the United States and other free countries. So there's a lot more to say about this, but really fundamentally, we care about freedom and democracy everywhere. We think it's intrinsically the right of every human being. I know President Bush believes that. But we also need to care about these issues strategically because if China should succeed in dominating the commanding heights of technology, AI, quantum computing, control of data, there will be no freedom anywhere in the world.
Dan, I'm going to ask you just a follow-up. How do you deal with the issue, though, of economics and trade here with China? Because there are many countries, and including our own, that have trade, sizable trade with Beijing. How do we deal with that and at the same time the global struggle for freedom? There's a tension there.
So the answer is we learned during COVID, too many of our supply chains run through China, and there's just a very fundamental, I think, business rethink, separate from all the moral dimensions we're discussing, which is that there is acute political risk associated with businesses that are tied to production in China. So American companies, global companies are making their own decisions to diversify. That's one. Two, you just heard from Tsai, 90% of advanced semiconductor manufacturing in the world is on the island of Taiwan, which is a fundamental problem because they took my phone away from me before I came out, but I was going to hold up my phone and say, all of you, your phones will stop working if China invades Taiwan and controls global semiconductor production. Your cars will stop working because guess what? All of our cars now are computers that rely on these advanced chips. I could go on and on, but fundamentally, we have to think about, I think, economic security as part of our national security, and we need to not fall back into blunt protectionism. Because guess what? 95% of the people live out of the United States. American companies do want to export to them, invest in those countries, trade with them. That's how we became prosperous, right? Was being tied to the world. But we have to think, I think, about building a free world economy, which is what we did during the Cold War. And guess what? It worked. Even today, the major economies of the world are all America's allies, with the exception of China, Japan, the European Union, Great Britain, etc. Let's think about building a free world economy that is much less vulnerable to the Chinese Communist Party's attempts to recast world order in an anti-democratic direction.
Damon, let's come to you. With the Russian aggression in Ukraine, this is just spotlighted in this global struggle for freedom. But it also brings about a real challenge, at least as I've witnessed. You have countries that have been very vocal and have condemned Russia for its aggression. But then you have other countries that are just sitting on the sidelines. And some have identified them as sort of the middle. They don't want to, the middle countries, they don't want to align themselves, even though some of them may be democratic, with the United States and with the West, per se. And then you have those that, are the few that are sitting over here and either completely silent or endorsing or having endorsed what Putin has done. How do we, in this struggle for freedom, how do we reach out to those countries that are, as it's been put, in the middle?
So part of it is to understand that we are in this together, and free societies better have each other's backs, or individually will be in trouble. As we've seen the autocrats work together, forge coalitions of cooperation, we need to understand that that's central for us. So the Ukraine issue is compelling and challenging, and that it is the most egregious case of a strong neighbor denying the identity, the existence. It is the seeds of what leads to genocide, of extinguishing a people's identity. Vladimir Putin's language denying the separate identity of a Ukrainian people and then acting on that through a full-scale invasion with extraordinary atrocities that are driven by wiping out this culture, this identity, and a sovereign state taking not just the freedom of individuals, the freedom of a neighbor. It is a fallback to a 19th century mate's right world. And if we allow that world to take shape, that is a direct threat and challenge to not just the freedom of individuals, but the freedom and the sovereignty of so many nations around the world. And it's why, in part, Ukraine's fight is so much bigger than Ukraine and merits our rallying behind it. At the same time, to address this issue, we have to understand that we've got to underscore the sense of solidarity with others that are struggling and great challenge. And so part of what is important is that we are attuned to the needs and important challenges that are being faced in the global south, from the people who are on the streets of Khartoum in Sudan, the struggles that we've seen with a war that's broken out in Ethiopia, to struggles around the world, and understanding that we have a sense of common cause, a sense of solidarity to support their efforts, and that it's not a value judgment on struggle, it's a sense of understanding that we have to be there. And it's both that moral support, but it's also the real, tangible, concrete support. I think the difference we see is the situation for Ukraine, and indeed for Taiwan, I think will have cascading effects for the trajectory of freedom of democracy and impact all democracy movements around the world if Vladimir Putin is able to get away with this invasion, if Xi Jinping thinks he can get away with his invasion, the knock-on consequences throughout the world, I think, will be quite dramatic.
Alliances matter, and that matters greatly, this particular area, because it's an area, at least in my own personal view, that I think we have to really work and work and work. Nicole, the issue of disinformation, the president of Taiwan, she referenced it in her own remarks here. Disinformation has really been a challenge to our country, a challenge to many countries, and we've witnessed playing out, for example, in Latin America. There were the massive protests in Chile, and it was documented, actually, that Russian disinformation and use of social media actually spawned those massive protests. Mm-hmm. How is this factored into our struggle?
Absolutely. Let me make one comment about this middle country issue as well, and then come back to the disinformation point. I think that we have to instill a sense of urgency, and in a sense, not just that this is a moral fight or we're helping some people in some faraway country, but if we think for any moment that leaders that would brutally repress people at home are not going to do the same and not disrupt the things which each country cares about, we're fooling ourselves, right? And so if you look at Russia has invaded Ukraine, some people think it's an issue of Ukraine. It is, in fact, a global struggle for all of us. But also, Russia is disrupting the economy of many, many European countries. It's weaponizing oil and pipelines and the entire economy of Europe. And so if we think that it's something which countries can sit out and not be impacted, I think we need to really create that urgency among governments.
By the way, I'll just add this, Egypt relies 75% on grain from Ukraine. China relies, I believe it's a very high figure, also relies on its grain from Ukraine.
Right, so that type of authoritarianism rarely stays isolated to one place. And so countries who think they can sit it out because they're not involved, I think are incorrect in that. Disinformation is a huge issue, and I think the issue is not just in how much misinformation we're seeing coming out of authoritarian governments, but we're also seeing a weaponization of technology in general. One of the things which we're greatly concerned about as we see the courageous women and also men in Iran going to the streets, we see the government shutting down the internet. What's interesting is, because it's a means of connecting people who are courageously fighting for their freedoms, and what we're seeing is that authoritarians are using the exact same tactics in all different countries. We've seen it in many countries around the world, in Russia, in China, where the government has created, has weaponized the access to social media, has weaponized the ability of people to connect through social media, but then also to demonize and to use disinformation to really go after people who are committed and working for the cause of freedom. I think it's where we as democracies have to think about what technological solutions we can also develop and provide to other democratic actors around the world. I think we have to work closely with some of the larger social media companies to think about their role in this struggle for freedom, because it's not something where there is a neutral. Neutral is not really an option on this.
Dan, on this issue, are we doing enough in dealing with disinformation? And what else should we be doing?
It's such a hard question. Thanks for saving the easy one for us. I was hoping to time
Well, that's
out
why
here.
they took away your cell phone, too.
So look, I think we all know broadly what some of the long-term answers are. Civic education to help citizens understand what is fake news and what is real, including, they're doing this now in Northern Europe, actually educating children around, in Sweden. We have a neighbor called Russia. Russia has penetrated our media ecosystem, our information ecosystem, and is running a campaign to fool you and convince you of things that are not true and actually are against your country's interests. So I think the piece of it is all of us getting a little smarter about, should we believe everything we see online in a social media feed? That's part of it. I think another part of it is obviously thinking about the role of American companies. Now, I'll be the first to say, I don't like, obviously, quasi-monopolies on anything, but I think we have to think about a world in which American tech companies are all broken up, decapitated, and suddenly Chinese tech companies are the dominant players, including in the information space. We don't want to live in that kind of world. I think point 3, we have to think about the value of independent media in new and creative ways that fundamentally sometimes foreign authoritarian influence campaigns in the information space can work because people conflate those campaigns with real news. And so let's go back to thinking about the value of our independent media, trusted sources, editors, curating, rather than just raw news feeds, which may or may not be real. Finally, I think it's just human nature. It's very easy to see something online and get very excitable and agitated, and suddenly you're arguing with your neighbor or your family member. And we just have to remember that part of winning in the information space is pulling together, understanding that this is part of the great power competition in some domains, that foreign authoritarian actors are attacking our democracies in the information space. And we need to understand what they're up against. Finally, I would just say, we have to help people inside of closed societies get real news, because there is a hunger. The US did this during the Cold War, as you well know. We have to go back to playing offense and sharing real news with people in closed societies, because in Iran and China and Russia now, they have or are building great firewalls that are designed to convince people that state propaganda is true. And it's a lie, much of it. But so helping people understand the truth, including in these societies.
I'm going to come to Damon, and I want to ask you about corruption. The president also referenced corruption in her remarks, but a quick one for Dan, and that is India. Here we have one of the largest democracies in the Indo-Pacific, and I mentioned Ukraine. It's been challenging because India relies, on Russia for its arms. Russia is the #1 supplier to India for arms, but also there's the crude oil, which India relies on Russia for. How do we deal with a democracy and an ally and a partner, strategic partner like India during this time? It's part of our struggle for freedom, but we're also having challenges with it.
Thank you. You know India so well, so I hope you'll agree with my points. India, we have a huge stake in India's success as a strong, thriving, prosperous democracy that frankly can have another 20 years ahead like China's last 20 years in terms of its own development trajectory, but obviously under free institutions and with free people. A huge stake. There's no other country in the world with the democratic ballast other than the United States of India. There are things that have really pulled us together here for the last 20, 25 years, starting with our mutual concern about Chinese power and ambition. Indians, frankly, are much more like-minded with us on this score than some of our oldest allies in Europe and elsewhere. The Indians also have a China problem, which is that they share the world's longest undemarcated border with China. So it's very personal and up close for them. So the answer has to be to work closely with India to encourage its continuing democratic success story and prosperity. But we have very different views on things like trade, on things like data, on things like free media, and we're just going to have to work together despite our differences. But I think everybody needs to understand, if you haven't been to India, that this is a vibrant, pluralistic, open society. President Bush, to his great credit, saw that, established a transformed relationship with India through his personal leadership. And he was looking ahead 20, 30 years and understanding that great democracies have to work together to sustain a free and open world. I think India is going to be central to that.
Thank you for that, because I think it underscores that we're close partners, and we have a strategic partner established by President George W. Bush, but at the same time, there are challenges. We don't see things always eye to eye, and in this struggle, it's not always aligned. Corruption. Damon, isn't this, the president did mention that in her own remarks, isn't this also a real challenge to this struggle? And how do we combat it?
It's a massive challenge, and we've really made a good transition from perception of understanding corruption, bribe here, there, thanks to the good work of people like Charles Davidson, who's with us, Chris Walker at the endowment, to understand that we're actually talking about something bigger, about kleptocracy, about how the use of financial assets gets linked in with autocratic regimes, using financial systems often in the West, and this pernicious intersection, so that Vladimir Putin isn't just a dictator, he's an extremely wealthy individual that has built a kleptocratic machine that has been mirrored and developed by President of Equatorial Guinea. That we have seen the use of autocrats. You think of China's Belt and Road Initiative, $65 billion have gone into Venezuela from Beijing. And yet, it's the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, more than Ukraine. Something's wrong here. We are dealing with something that is far more complicated and pernicious. It took us a long time, and Paula, you'll remember, we finally, in debates about Ukraine, understood that corruption was a national security issue, because the moment that a Kremlin could use gas deals to compromise politicians, you could lose the ability to really support a genuine democratic struggle. I think our understanding has dramatically caught up. We're still trying to help folks understand that what we're dealing with is a more complicated kleptocratic network in which we have often been implicated through our own financial systems. And coming to terms with that is hard. Ceding the support for investigative journalists and exposure to hold and expose these issues, hold them account. We've seen tremendous work by courageous journalists that have played out in Pandora Papers and others to expose this. We see real movement in the United States and Europe and others to think about how to tighten that scrutiny. We see much more strict review of transactions involving autocratic regimes and what that means. But until we get this right, when you have leaders that also become the financial power barons in their countries, they're really building a system in which they've so raped and pillaged their own economy, their own people, that they've made it hard for themselves to leave office without doing so in a casket. So it is pernicious. And I think exposing that, understanding that, beginning to help support local groups to hold folks accountable, but then shutting off the avenues for that and the network among dictators to finance themselves.
It's a key issue, and it's one that also was not always addressed in the past, but now is front and center. Nicole, before I go for the last round with all of you, I want to ask you about Iran, because what we're witnessing in Iran is really a mass movement, and it's come up and up and up, and we really haven't been reacting to it. We haven't been, I even hate using the word reacting. We should be engaged in it and should have been engaged in being supportive. It also has to do with broad freedoms. Here you do have this thuggery at the top. How do we deal with it? What should we be doing here? And this is part of a struggle for freedom, definitively.
Absolutely. It's I would say, one of the most poignant and courageous, visible struggles for freedom that we're seeing around the world. The fact that people are going to the street, they know that it is literally life and death for them. We know that there are people who are sitting with death penalty convictions that are awaiting them for asking for the most simple and fundamental freedoms. The power of women in that country is absolutely phenomenal, and what we're seeing is that women, particularly younger women, are just saying we will not stand for what has been decades and decades of repression. The world has to see that this is not an Iranian women's struggle. This is a global struggle, because what they are asking for is an end to a regime that has denied them freedoms for so long.
And also is corrupt.
And extraordinarily corrupt, and in alliance with China, with Russia and others. And the only way that these regimes can maintain power, they're not maintaining power because they're building support from their citizens, or they're having a transparent interaction where they collect taxes and they deliver services. There's absolutely no functioning relationship between people and government in Iran or in many of these dictatorial societies. And so we have to go, I think very much to Damon's point, we have to go at what are the sources of funding. How is it that these regimes are able to maintain their support? We also have to look at to what extent it's being done through Western or through American financial systems, because we have the ability, obviously, to choke off those points. I think that we also have to isolate Iran from the global community in many ways. What we see is there are many places where Iran sits at the table in many places, and I think that we have to say that that behavior is not something that's going to be acceptable in international fora, and that they will be legitimized by their presence at the table. I think we need to look for every means to support the women and the others who are on the streets. And again, I think some of that is technological support to figure out how they can sustain that movement, and rhetorical support also, that we're speaking out on a very regular basis so that does not get out of the headlines.
We have just literally under 3 minutes, and so each of you get about a minute. I thought a final question, let's start with you, Dan, and just come down the line, is what are the most effective strategies in this global struggle for freedom and for literally helping, furthering, advancing freedom, and supporting those human rights defenders on the ground? And each of you represent an institution that's on the front lines, working with so many who are also really on, front and center in country and on the front lines. What are the best strategies, most
so I think
effective?
fundamentally, Paula, we have to think about there is a huge bottom-up demand and energy for democratic dignity, for accountability, transparency, the most basic rights. And we, I think, confuse ourselves when we look in a top-down way and we talk about democratic decline. Nobody is choosing to move in an anti-democratic direction. It's authoritarian leaders who are taking their countries in undemocratic directions. So when we think about our global engagement, well beyond our diplomacy, which often is government to government, we need to think about supporting citizens who are trying to build freer and more open and more prosperous societies. The other thing I would say in 10 seconds is we have to work very closely with our democratic allies. There are very exciting things happening on India. The Quad. There's I2U2, which is India, Israel, the UAE, and the US. There's AUKUS, US, UK, Australia. There are exciting things happening in terms of Sweden and Finland have joined NATO. Let's get the democracies together to try to solve some big problems here.
Okay, great. Nicole?
Excellent. We know that authoritarians have very clear tools. They are in technology, they're in corruption, transnational repression. We see them. We've got great journals that are being put out outlining what those are, and what we need to do is systematically go after them. We need to mobilize democracies to have a bulwark against those and really take it on the offense. And while we're countering authoritarian power, we also have to know that the people on the ground who are courageously doing things which are much harder than any of us do on a daily basis, that they need every bit of support. So that means that we have to rhetorically recognize and meet with and validate their struggle, keep it in the headlines. We need to provide them with the tools that they need, and we need to make sure that we don't validate the repression that the leaders of many of these countries are enacting on their own people by meeting with and failing to call those out when we see them.
It's also great. Freedom House puts out its annual report that everyone looks to, not just in the United States, but globally. Globally, it's a tool and an instrument that provides an important standard and measure and is so helpful to policymakers as well as others.
Thank you.
Damon.
Paula, we like to say at the National Endowment for Democracy that we need to be confident in the values that underpin what we're talking about, the democratic aspirations, these values. We can be proud of our work, but we need to be humble in our approach. At the end of the day, supporting the aspirations of democracy or for people to be able to make their own mistakes, to have a system to resolve differences peacefully, and a system to fix themselves, improve themselves. That's an American story. And that humility, I think, is really important to understand that when we talk about the struggle for freedom, it's not a Washington strategy for the world. It's a recognition of the universal aspirations of freedom, and we're simply being asked to support that. President Bush said that liberty can be delayed, but it cannot be denied. And I'll just close with the simplicity of some things that President Bush did in office. In Belarus, which has been in the news a lot because of the protests, the fraudulent election, long before we saw the democracy movement of today, President Bush welcomed into the Oval Office the widows of the disappeared, journalists, activists, men who had been murdered, disappeared, quote unquote, by the Lukashenko regime, the same regime in power today. And President Bush just simply welcomed the widows into the Oval Office for a conversation. We see you, we hear you, we respect you, we stand by you. That has really stuck with all of those people that I hear today on the streets of Belarus that understand that we didn't just forget about them. President Bush was in Slovakia and Bratislava to meet President Putin. But before he met President Putin, he met with a group of freedom fighters that spanned generations. Those who had stood up to the Nazis during World War II and were towards the end of their life. Those who had resisted communism in Central and Eastern Europe in an epic struggle. But then brought into that group those who are on the front lines of that struggle today, whether in Moldova, Serbia, elsewhere. And the simplicity of welcoming, we are here in common cause. We stand on the shoulders of those who have come before, but we have to learn, innovate, raise our game, and fundamentally have each other's backs. And these were some simple lessons that you saw President Bush put into action that remain relevant today in this struggle, which isn't just our struggle, it's Venezuelan struggle, it's Iranian struggle, and we're simply asking, let's give them some support.
And if I may add in closing, because you cited President Bush during his tenure, but what is, I think, very significant as well, that has continued on right here at the Bush Center and at the Bush Institute in terms of the support for Afghans, all Afghans, Afghan women, Burma also, I will call it Myanmar, Burma, and also for North Korea, among many others. And that fight continues. So as I promised you, it's a star panel, and it was a star panel, so please join me in thanking them for setting the conversation.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the CEO of Harris X, Tertan Nesho.